I think in a lot of ways I'm extraordinarily privileged, right? Because first of all, there's been a lot of feminist scholars, and not just feminist scholars, but a lot of female scholars before me that have really made possible what I'm doing now. And also that I'm coming from a relatively privileged position in terms of being from the global north, having a middle-class economic background, having a mother who was educated in university. So I think my experiences as a young female scholar are really privileged ones. So then I think what that means for me is that I need to think about how to leverage that privilege to make sure that the academy is more equitable. So this gets beyond just questions of diversity, of just adding people that are different, but questions of equity, and structuring both my teaching and my research and my administrative practice to leverage the privilege that I have, but also to think about the ways in which experiences where I have been excluded or silenced or felt on the margins because of being a woman can help me think about what equity might mean. So I think that my experience of being a teenager in the US, like a young teenager in the US when the September 11th attacks happened, actually really radicalized me, really made me question the role of my government in the world. What were we doing as the result of these attacks? What did these attacks, and then that led me to sort of read the history, a more radical history of the United States, right? To think differently about what I'd been taught in secondary school, high school, about American history in the world. So I think I came to IR in part because of this own personal politics of being really critical, of wanting to know why the US was acting like an empire, how has the US acted like an empire, what have been the effects of that in terms of the early conquering of the United States and all of the settler colonialism, slavery, as well as how we act in the world. And I think I had a lot of great professors when I was in undergrad who really fostered critical thinking in terms of trying to understand what makes various things possible, not taking at face value the explanations of a state or of a government, but thinking about whose voices aren't we hearing, what's missing. Yeah, so I think this is how I came to be interested in IR. I probably had an exception because the university where I did my undergrad was a sort of very different kind of place than a lot of other political science departments in a lot of other US universities. So what this meant in practice was that I was reading a lot more radical thinkers than I think a lot of people who did political science in other places. And so I'm not sure that I can sort of make this comment as a whole. If I can't really make a whole comment about comparing how critical race theory gets taught in the US versus in Europe. I do think that in some ways it's been interesting to see how European reflections on American critical race theory seem to excuse Europe as not America. So discussions around race in Europe often tend to say, well, yes, but we didn't have slavery here in the way the United States did, so the same critical race theory doesn't apply. And I think then this has interesting effects for excluding the whole of critical race theory from European discourse, right? Like this article that was in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about the French discussions of critical race theory as being non-applicable to France, which is super interesting, right? In terms of thinking about how much American critical race theory draws on Frantz Fanon, who is writing about the French colonization of Algeria from the perspective of someone who grew up in a French colony in the Caribbean, right? So I think there are a lot of thinkers like Fanon or Du Bois in particular, W.B. Du Bois, who are much more global than they're given credit for, and whose theories can tell us something about global relations of race than they're often given credit for, right? Fanon is often seen to only apply to French colonies former French colonies in Africa. Du Bois is seen to often only apply to race relations in the US. But I think that these scholars can tell us something really interesting about how global forms of racial exclusion are entwined with global capitalism and provide a good starting point to begin to tease out what these differences actually are then. That was a really long answer, sorry.